Alright, this is the Dead Idea on YouTube, and I'm giving Anton a response to his science, religion and art video. Now, Anton in this video raises the contention or the question of where is the middle ground, so to speak, with scientific materialism and a sort of a theism or a sense of profundity within the world itself. Is there a middle ground? I think that there is, but I think that it's a hard road to travel, and I think that I think that exists for a few reasons. First, but I would like to deal with this sort of issue, even though it might be a little tangential, in a couple different ways. The first thing is that I would like to point out what is going on in terms of certain dialogues. That there are understandings now coming to an emerging proposition which I think are going to unify a more scientific worldview with a more humanities-based approach. I think that one thing that you raised was that science that lacks an understanding of psychology. Well, I think that psychology, neuroscience, etc. is merging together to form a cognitive science. I think that might be the bell end of the future that is coming about. I think that certain linguists have begun to try and understand biological components and theories. One example is Steven Pinker, who in his book The Language Instinct tries to build on some of Noam Chomsky's work and tries to argue the idea of language acquisition as a kind of organ which is instinctively fulfilled through and has a genetic and material basis. Now, granted, these things are still kind of still not the prevailing worldview. They're still not the mainstream. But the fact is that these things are sort of emerging in terms of an interdisciplinary understanding between humanities and sciences now. And I think that these things have already occurred. I think that there have been certain attempts to fulfill sociological theories with evolutionary biology, and I think another good example is Kuhn in his idea of informational paradigms, essentially being the main term now used to describe any conventional informational theory as to regard to a prevailing worldview across the board, and it was originally contextually used in a reference to him solving problems with the philosophy of science. But what I would like to look at is the idea that there is a certain lack of understanding, but this isn't. I don't think that this comes across the board as. I don't think that material science has catered for psychology and sociology and whatever else. But I think that it would be a little insipid to say that humanities are tackling sciences in a sincere fashion. I think that they stress the mechanist clockwork view of the world. And even though that is the prevailing worldview, it lacks depth, it lacks subtlety, it lacks reference to things like an organic model, it lacks reference to a quantum model, it lacks historical reference to things like, say, James Gleick's work, where he, The Science of Chaos, where he examines sort of how chaos theory permeated science in multiple different fields. And by doing that, I think humanities kind of estranges science from the get-go. I think, as well, I think the reductionist model is also a little dated as well. I think the scientific methods are a little more sophisticated than that, even though they do stress a reductionist point of view. there is a reconstruction or a build-up, and there is a, I would like to think, a fairly sophisticated methodology or discussion of ongoing dialogue to determine what is and what isn't constituting evidence to a larger theoretical basis. So that reductionism eventually comes back as a construction. I think another thing which isn't particularly appreciated is this idea of homogenizing science as a science and technological narrative. Now, I'm not saying that those are distinct, but I'm saying that there can be specific questions thrown and identification of more specific elements than just homogenizing science as the bitch of the pharmaceutical companies as a whole. I think that by permeating that in rhetoric, and I've seen it done quite commonly, I just can't engage that as sincere rhetoric. The last thing that I would like to cover in this video is the idea of, has science been able to infect the soul of man? Like, to find a depth of being, of self-identification and identification of nature, and my answer to that is no. I think that the reason for that is that many people just are not scientifically literate, so they cannot grasp that understanding. It's alien from them, so they won't be able to get it. Like you cannot make an ecological connection to a water cycle or photosynthesis if you're not if you don't think about those things. You're not going to be thinking of that in a poetic form if you're barely familiar with the concepts. I think another thing though is this dystopian worldview of materialism, which I think is still very much aside from science. I think that this dystopian worldview might have been propagated by numerous factors, but I don't see science as being purely to blame for it. For example, I'll give you an argument against one of your own positions where you said, no, I wouldn't want to, live in, perpetuate my existence digitally or what have you, so you wouldn't want this kind of like virtual existence after your death, like you would just rather be gone, kaput, finish. What if I said that if it's culture and art and creativity, which essentially defines humanity uniquely as an animal, that sets us apart from others, that gives us a separate question, that we have essentially turned on the entire world and created and tried to expand our own horizons from the very subatomic to outer space to as many extremes as we possibly could. And it's only natural then that we turn our creative spirit, that turn our creative powers upon our own beings and reinvent ourselves outside of the original biology that we will define. It's like a recontextualization of being. Let's say it's the most sincere way that one could arrive at a idea of an Ubermensch, a Superman, a complete transcendence of the biological equation to begin with, a definition of your own nature. I think that there could be arguments for that being possibly a profound worldview, but I think that that's something that you would already disagree with, and that for me will be the biggest goal to any understanding of science in terms of incorporating it as a mysticism or in terms of some kind of mythopoetic context where it allows you to embrace the world, is that if you've already come with very defined ideas of what is nature and what is humanity, I think the more you do that to a specific position, the less room you're going to leave for science as a holistic narrative to be able to infect and influence your belief, to essentially infect and influence your very concept of a human soul, I guess, as a mythopoetic analysis too. So that's my thoughts, and get back to me.